On BBC1 shortly, Michael Barrett introduces Songs of Praise from the Hospital Church of St Lawrence's in Caterham, Surrey. Viewers to BBC Scotland have their own programme, Coast to Coast. Here on BBC2, A Life with Crime looks into some of the pressures and problems which occur during the day-to-day running of one of Britain's largest prisons, Walton Jail in Liverpool.
Government are not just political abstractions. Better than anyone, she can confirm that lack of information can seriously damage your health.
On BBC2 now, a change of programme, the first in a new series starring Rhoda. Here on 1 in 25 minutes, part 2 of the dramatisation about the American civil rights leader, Martin Luther King. First, the news.
500,000 civil servants strike over pay, bringing widespread disruption to government. Westminster steps up security after Friday's bombing as MPs paid tribute to Mr. Airy Neve. The damaged nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania starts to cool down. And Israel's Prime Minister begins his state visit to Egypt with a tour of the pyramids. Good evening. A 24-hour national strike by more than 500,000 white-collar civil servants has brought widespread disruption to the machinery of government. Thousands of people have been unable to collect health or social security benefits. Airports and seaports have been jammed, with long delays for outgoing passengers and even longer queues at the immigration desks. Customs men have again had to resort to their honesty boxes, saying it's a golden day for the smuggler. The 8 civil service unions are split 6-4, 2 against, accepting the government pay offer amounting to an average of 25% over the next year. But the strike call was well obeyed. Gary Lloyd reports.
The unions claimed they'd brought 90% of the civil service to a stop. The government said they were exaggerating, and main affairs of state weren't significantly affected. Some departments were halted, and others reduced to half speed. Action by prison officers, clerks and officials interrupted 2/3 of the trials at the Old Bailey. At the High Court, however, despite picketing, it was almost business as usual. No civil cases were stopped. But with security officers on strike, police took over their duties inside. Some barristers went into court without wigs and gowns because the robing room was locked. Offices in the Queen's Bench Division issuing summonses and judges' orders were also closed. But pickets admitted some union members here had refused to obey the strike call.
In Newcastle, pickets were out from first thing this morning at the headquarters of the Department of Health and Social Security. 12,000 clerical staff work here, and it's the second biggest bureaucratic effort in the world after the Pentagon. They deal with 4 tons of mail a day and use 50 miles of stationery. But the management here says the one-day stoppage will have little effect because most pension book and maternity allowance claims are dealt with 3 weeks in advance, and it won't be difficult to make up the time. But at a mass meeting later in the day, civil servants voted unanimously to escalate their action to a full strike in the DHSS, and that recommendation will now go forward to the national executives.
The one place that's unaffected is Buckingham Palace. The St James's Palace branch of the union, which looks after this building, has refused to come out. This morning the Royal Mews were mucked out and vacuum cleaners are whirring away inside. So while Whitehall may be at a standstill, at this end of the Mall it's royal business as usual.
Visitors to the Tower of London were not so fortunate. The deserted courtyards were as lonely as the times when they enclosed noble prisoners. The beefeaters today were on guard to prevent visitors from going in rather than anyone getting out. They made one exception, though. A centuries-old legend says that the day the ravens leave the tower, its turrets will crumble into the Thames and the empire will fall. So the Raven Master was given special dispensation to go in and feed his birds.
Well, one exception to an otherwise well-observed call. Today's strike's about the civil service's pay research system. Under this, comparisons are made every year between civil service pay and outside employment, and then unions and the civil service department bargain about the increases needed to bring civil servants in line. Well, that system hasn't operated in the years of pay policy, and civil servants claim they've slipped back because outside workers have got round pay policy. So we've had 5 weeks now of selective strikes by the two biggest unions, representing about 300,000 of the 500,000 civil servants. That's affecting computers, Scottish courts, land registry and so on. Well, the government then offered a staged return to pay research. But the first offer was so low at 7% that all 8 unions agreed to back today's action, everybody out for 1 day. But on Friday, too late to stop the action, the government made a new offer. That's 9% with the rest in 2 stages, probably 8% in August, with a further 8% next year in March, making a deal probably averaging about 25%. Well, some union leaders think that's the best they can get.
First of all, because very large offers are due, something between 25 and 40% in general. It would be ridiculous to expect such a large payment all in one sum on the 1st of April. We don't want inflation to develop, and we thought that a gradual approach was a sensible and right one.
Well, why is there then this great bitterness between some of the unions leaders and others?
It is true there is disagreement. I hope there isn't bitterness, and I hope that we can overcome our internal squabbles. I think that is in great danger of deflecting us from the very important negotiations in which we are now engaged. They have been campaigning, and there is, of course, a very powerful case on merit and in terms of our agreements for the full amount to be paid from the 1st of April. But we do have to have some consideration for the country's interest as well.
Well, the two biggest unions are bitterly angry at the others for meeting the Prices Minister, Mr. Hattersley, the night before the new offer, when the two had made clear they weren't available. And at a rally in Central Hall today, they expressed their determination to battle on without the others if necessary, and even make it an election issue.
But we, in the society, have made our plans on the basis of a long drawn-out campaign, if necessary, fighting through and beyond the general election, if necessary. I will speak on behalf of the Executive Council of the Society. The Executive Council of the Society will not reach an agreement with the government until the members have told us that they are ready to reach an agreement. And until that moment comes, we will lead you on in the fight wherever that may take us. The government are going to be deeply embarrassed if they have to deal with a civil service in turmoil during a general election. The Prime Minister is going to the country on the basis that only his government knows how to deal with unions. By God, he can't even deal with his own unions.
Well, Mr. Gilman's threats won't be lost on the government as it goes into the election. In contrast, just as other public sector unions are fixing up meetings to reach settlements, or at least negotiate peacefully. Today, for example, the bulk of British Steel's workforce agreed an 8% pay deal. And it could be that if the civil service wrangle continues, we might see the TUC intervening.
One section of the civil service generally exempted from today's action was that involved in security. After the terrorist alert after the murder of Mr. Ari Neve on Friday, the unions agreed that both general security measures and the watch on people entering and leaving the country should be maintained. Christopher Morris reports on the situation at Heathrow Airport, London.
With over 300 flights cancelled, the British Airports Authority had warned people to stay away unless absolutely necessary. Nevertheless, departure lounges were soon packed and huge queues built up at passport control. Of course, since Friday's assassination at the Houses of Parliament of Mr. Ari Neve, there's been a major security alert at the airport. And the main fear for the police today is that amid the confusion of this strike, the killers might try and slip out of the country. Certainly today's strike action didn't exactly help police and special branch officers who've been instructed to keep a special lookout for a number of wanted Irish terrorist suspects. Many extra police and security men mingled with the crowds, and frequent warnings were also broadcast.
Passengers are also reminded not to leave their baggage unattended at any time.
Because of the murder hunt, however, the strikers did make one concession. Their unions agreed to keep at least a skeleton staff on duty in immigration.
The Home Secretary, Mr. Merlin Rees, has firmly dismissed claims that police in Northern Ireland knew Éirí Niamh was at the top of an IRA death list. Answering newspaper reports that the Royal Ulster Constabulary warned Scotland Yard 2 weeks before the murder, Mr. Rees told the Commons this afternoon no such death list was in the RUC's possession. He went on to warn the terrorists that acts of this kind serve only to reinforce the resolve of the British people not to be divided in the face of violence. Security is now being stepped up for all candidates in the run-up to the election. At Parliament itself, where Mr. Niamh's car was blown up last Friday, the extra precautions include the closing of Westminster Hall to the public and the confining of traffic to one entrance. Gavin Hewitt watched how the police coped outside the Palace of Westminster this morning.
MPs and their staff arrived for the last 3 days of this Parliament to a Palace of Westminster acutely conscious of its security. Some members were stopped by police and had the underside of their cars examined for suspect devices with a mirror on a pole, a sight not uncommon in Ulster but never seen before at the House of Commons. Some members who parked their cars in the streets overnight were asked whether they'd checked underneath before starting their journey. But ministers' cars with their Whitehall chauffeurs sailed into New Palace Yard without even stopping. Indeed, the majority of vehicles entered the Commons on the nod of recognition from a policeman, or at the most a glance at the Commons badge on the car windscreen. Even vehicles delivering food and equipment were waved through. Although the Commons is closed to the public today, apart from limited access to the gallery, it has been decided to increase security measures here, much as at an airport. When visitors come to the house now, they'll have to have their bags searched, and this morning they're setting up metal screens to detect whether anyone is carrying any metal before they enter inside the house. A foretaste of the security that must now accompany the election campaign came this afternoon in Smith Square, which houses the headquarters of both main political parties. A bomb squad officer was forced to break into a suspicious car. This time it was a false alarm, but police revealed fairly brutally that nothing will be left to chance.
Inside the Commons, MPs of all parties were united in their tributes to Mr. Niamh. They heard the Prime Minister and Mrs. Thatcher speak emotionally of Mr. Niamh as a courageous man, victim of a contemptible assassination.
The gusto, for today at least, seemed to have gone out of British politics. For just a brief moment, the fripperies of party arguments disappeared, and the whole House of Commons joined together in its deep grief for their murdered companion. After the prayers that begin every parliamentary day, the Speaker told the House, formally and briefly, of the death of Éirí Niamh Esquire, DSO, OBE, MC, TD, member for Abingdon. Mrs. Thatcher, surrounded by her shadow cabinet, was obviously very near to tears as she listened. And then, with determined self-control, she moved to the dispatch box. She spoke of the work Mr. Niamh had done for Northern Ireland.
He asked me if he could do the work in Northern Ireland. He loved it, felt he was beginning to understand the sensitivities of the people, felt he had a contribution to make and wanted to continue with it. Tragically, he fell victim to a group of people who, because they were unable to conquer men's hearts and minds by persuasion, turned to killing and murder. And we condemn them with all the power and strength at our command.
And like the Prime Minister after her, Mrs. Thatcher paid a tribute to Mrs. Niamh. Éirí's death, said Mrs. Thatcher, dropping the formal parliamentary address, Éirí's death diminishes us all. We mourn and we salute a true and a faithful friend. Then the Prime Minister, speaking in a voice hushed with grief, spoke of this tragic, violent and despicable murder. He understood Mrs. Thatcher's sorrow and sense of loss.
I would like to express on our behalf our sympathy to the Right Honourable Lady and to her colleagues who have lost a valued and an esteemed colleague, a member of their own councils. And let me say finally that I share with the Right Honourable Lady the view that nothing that has happened must be allowed to deflect any of us, these violent and evil happenings, from endeavouring to secure peace and justice for all the people of Northern Ireland.
And later, Mr. Jerry Fitt, who believes so strongly in a united Ireland, he deeply impressed the House when he said he would not want to live in an Ireland united by such terrible crimes as this. And so the Commons' brief tributes ended. I hope, said the Speaker, that we can assume that Mrs. Thatcher and the Prime Minister have spoken for everyone in the House. And sadly, the House of Commons murmured its agreement.
This evening, Mrs. Thatcher made her reply to the Prime Minister's ministerial broadcast, which she'd postponed last week after Mr. Neave's murder. She began by thanking Mr. Callaghan for the generosity of his tribute. But now she said it was time to turn to the task ahead, the general election.
To make it worthwhile to go out and get on in this country again, we've got to cut taxes. The tax on earnings, the tax on savings, the tax on talent. That means we've got to stop government spending so much of our money. When a government won't economise, it means that every family in the country has to do so instead. Every extra pound paid in tax is a pound less to spend on things the family needs, on food, heating bills, running a home or running a car. It means there's that much less to spend on the children or helping one's parents. That's what it's all about.
Sir Alfred Broughton, the Labour MP who was too ill to attend last week's vote of no confidence, has died aged 76. Sir Alfred suffered from chronic bronchitis and had a mild heart attack a week before the vote. He'd been MP for Batley and Morley in Yorkshire for 30 years. Abroad now, in Cairo, Prime Minister Begin has been sitting down to dinner with President Sadat tonight during the first ever state visit by an Israeli premier to Egypt. Earlier, Mr. Begin visited the pyramids and a synagogue in Cairo, as Keith Graves reports.
Mr. Begin arrived early for the visit he'd longed to make ever since President Sadat's trip to Israel 18 months ago. It was, however, a deliberately low-key affair with little of the razzmatazz that surrounded that visit. Security was one consideration. Mr. Begin is a prime target anywhere, at any time, but never more so than here and now. And being a Prime Minister and not a head of state, he was not met by President Sadat himself. Mr. Begin did take the time to inspect a guard of honour, and his emotions must have been mixed. The escort for the man who fled from Poland before the war was a goose-stepping Egyptian soldier wearing the once familiar coal scuttle helmet. He's done the usual musts of any tourist visiting Cairo, and he insists this is a tourist rather than a working visit. The monument to Egypt's unknown soldier who died fighting the Israelis. The pyramids, which must have been something of an ordeal with the suffocating Hamsin wind blowing in from the desert. An especially emotional stop was at the main synagogue in the center of Cairo. Years of neglect and an ever-decreasing congregation have turned it into a grubby and almost totally ignored building. Yet it is impressive, if only because throughout the years of conflict between the two nations, it's continued to stand as a reminder of more peaceful times past and as a sign of hope that those days would return. There are working sessions interspersed with the sightseeing, for much remains to be clarified, even agreed about the peace treaty. As the Egyptian television commentator said as Mr. Begin arrived, there is still a long way to go to achieve peace in the Middle East. This is Keith Graves in Cairo.
Israel says she's captured a cargo ship carrying Palestinian guerrillas. A military spokesman says the ship, the Stephanie, flying a Cypriot flag, was intercepted in the Mediterranean. It was carrying weapons and explosives, which the Israelis say were intended to be used on a raid against civilian targets. Off the coast of Malaya, more than 100 Vietnamese refugees drowned when their boat capsized while being towed out to sea by police. Another 123 was saved. United Nations officials said the tragedy needn't have happened. The refugees wanted to put in at Mer Singh, but Malaysian authorities refused. In Cape Town, the Erasmus Commission, which has been investigating South Africa's so-called Muldergate scandal, has said cabinet members were not aware of any irregularities. The Commission's first report last December exposed massive misuse of funds by the government's information department. The former head of that department, Connie Mulder, and his deputy, Eshel Rudy, have since alleged senior ministers knew what was happening. The Commission's second report refutes this, but our correspondent, John Humphreys, says it's unlikely to stem the tide of criticism from the opposition. However, as Humphreys now reports, the political repercussions so far have been limited.
They're holding a by-election in Randfontein because their MP was Connie Mulder, and he was forced to resign over the scandal that now bears his name. So you might think the opposition would be making great political capital from the scandal. In fact, their canvassers have discovered people just don't want to know about Muldergate.
Could you tell us, please, how do you feel about the Progressive Federal Party standing for the first time ever?
Here, at least, it seems it's not going to cost the ruling National Party a single vote.
You support that?
Yeah.
Are you still a National Party supporter despite the so-called Muldergate scandal?
Yeah, well, I think it's the people, you know, it's not the party. You can't go for the party.
To many Afrikaner nationalists, Mulder did no more than was necessary to defend his country, and they're impressed by the fact that he steadfastly refused to be interviewed, staying quietly at home rather than seeking personal publicity. Dr. Mulder did invite me in for a chat without the film cameras, though, and was quite happy to talk about his role in the affair. He says that he has clean hands and, given the chance, would do the same sort of things all over again. But he's obviously deeply aggrieved at the way he's been treated by the National Party. He has called the state president, in effect, a liar for the things he said about his role in the affair. But he would not say whether he thought he should now resign. Down in Cape Town, the move to depose the president is underway. This is a unique document and a unique occasion, members of Parliament signing a petition calling for the impeachment of the state president.
Yeah, are we on? Yes, but if you'll just sign there.
The move will not succeed because at least 30 MPs must sign, and there are only 27 in the more liberal opposition parties. But despite the odds, the opposition's determined to go through with it. And there's a feeling in the opposition caucus for the first time in years that the tide is beginning to turn in their favour. Not that they could possibly win the next election if the government is forced to call one soon, but that at least the National Party is under greater pressure than ever before.
This is John Humphreys in Cape Town.
There's better news tonight from the United States, where the danger of a disaster at the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor seems to be receding. Officials say a dangerous gas bubble inside the reactor near Middletown is getting much smaller. They say the fuel temperature is dropping and releases of radiation are being confined. Martin Bell reports.
The weather around 3 Mile Island was gloomy, but the news from there much brighter. The hydrogen bubble at the top of the reactor was estimated to have shrunk from 850 to 50 cubic feet. Ground for optimism, officials said. But at Civil Defense Headquarters for Dauphin County, which includes the city of Harrisburg, preparations were still going ahead for the possible evacuation of up to 200,000 people.
If the word would come, we are prepared to go. As of about 2 days ago, we're prepared to go.
The emergency at the plant is still not over. More and more equipment has been hauled there for the containment and disposal of nuclear waste. And President Carter's visit to the site took place at a time when the evacuation of local residents was thought more likely to happen than not. The President and his wife were among the few visitors allowed on the 3 Mile Island site. They toured the control room where Mr. Carter, who's had some training in nuclear physics, asked a lot of detailed questions. The President was there to get information at first hand and to show local people that his concern over the accident is as great as theirs. As for the threat of evacuation, his mission was this.
To the people who live around the 3 Mile Island plant, that if it does become necessary, your governor, Governor Thornburg, will ask you and others in this area to take appropriate action to ensure your safety. If he does, I want to urge that these instructions be carried out calmly and exactly as they have been in the past few days.
And Mr. Carter, aware of the strength of feeling about the accident, has promised a full inquiry and a personal report to the nation.
Hey, my God, what's going on here?
The President came here to reassure the people, and to some extent he succeeded. But the only full reassurance they're looking for is the total cold shutdown of number 2 reactor, and they don't have that yet. This is Martin Vell in Middletown, Pennsylvania.
Now that the gas bubble seems to be disappearing and the crisis receding, the official investigation will seek to find out exactly what went wrong and what preventive measures can be taken in future. 2 points stand out, though. First, it's clear that several things went wrong all at the same time. Water didn't flow when it should have done, valves didn't close when they should have done, and so on. Second, the problem inside the reactor core was something that had never happened before, and, as far as one can tell, had never been anticipated. Under normal conditions, the fuel rods inside the reactor are covered with water under very high pressure. This water circulates constantly and keeps the fuel rods cool. During the accident, a valve stayed open by mistake and drained off too much of this water. The water, contaminated with radioactivity, was pumped to an adjoining building, and it was then that some radioactivity was released to the atmosphere. This loss of water exposed the top of the fuel rods, which then overheated and became damaged. The hot metal in the fuel rods reacted with the water, producing hydrogen gas, which prevented the water being pushed back into the reactor vessel. But by careful and painstaking work, the gas bubble is now being gradually bled off. The fuel rods are covered with water again, and it's thought the potentially highly dangerous situation has been averted. Soon the inquest will start. The accident has dealt a severe blow to the American nuclear program, already under pressure from environmentalists. And in Britain, politicians may well insist on a second look at plans by Britain's nuclear industry to develop pressurized water reactors here.
And finally, soccer and tonight's results. In Division 2, Sheffield United 3, West Ham 0, Wrexham 1, Charlton 1. Division 3, Colchester 2, Carlisle 1. And one score from a late kick-off, Southend 1, Watford 0. And so to the main points of the news again. 500,000 civil servants have been on strike for more pay. They've disrupted government services all over the country. Security for Parliament and parliamentary candidates is to be strengthened after the murder of Mr. Ari Neave. But the Home Secretary says the police did not know of a death list. Well, that's the news tonight. Good night.
Tonight at 10:55, reports on the background to the crisis in the nuclear power station in Pennsylvania. The Energy Secretary, Mr. Benn, and others will discuss the chances of a similar accident happening here. There'll also be an exclusive report on the most unusual jail system in the world, in Texas, and an assessment of the cost of the Grand National. That's in Tonight at 10:55.
Good evening to you. We'll now look at the weather, and low pressure is really the key word for today. By tomorrow we'll find the main centre having moved southeastwards to be over southern parts as this warm front moves southwestwards across northern parts of the country. So for tonight's weather, which we've got to go through first, and I think the word there is going to be a frost, just about everyone getting a touch of frost tonight. There's still some rather heavy showers in this southeastern corner. They'll be getting away fairly soon now during the latter part of the evening. Mostly dry and clear night in central parts. Still some showers left near these western coasts and up in the northwest for a time here. That rather persistent rain and sleet getting into northeast Scotland later. For tomorrow, quite a bright start in these eastern parts once again, but there'll be some showers again for most parts of the south. That rather more persistent rain and snow in this northeastern part of the country up in eastern Scotland and northeast England. Some brighter weather in the western parts, and later you'll find perhaps that it will be clearing up too in northern parts of Scotland. But a cold day everywhere and quite a windy day in the far north. That's it. A very good evening to you.